before Dr. Colman exposed its existence in his monograph, The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Britain's Control of the United States. Up to that time, Tavistock had successfully retained its secreted role in shaping the affairs of the United States, its government, and its people since its early beginning in London, in 1913 at Wellington House. Since Dr. Colman's original article exposing this ultra-secret organization, others have come forward with claims of authorship, which they were unable to substantiate. Tavistock began as a propaganda-creating and disseminating organization centered at Wellington House, which was where the original organization was put together with intent of shaping a propaganda outlet that would break down the stiff public resistance being encountered to the looming war between Britain and Germany. The project was given to Lords Rockmere and Northcliffe, and their mandate was to produce an organization capable of manipulating public opinion and directing that manufactured opinion down the desired pathway to support for a declaration of war by Great Britain against Germany. Funding was provided by the British royal family, and later by the Rothschilds, to whom Lord Northcliffe was related through marriage. Arnold Toynbee was selected as Director of Future Studies. Two Americans, Walter Lippmann and Edward Bemis, were appointed to handle the manipulation of American public opinion in preparation for the entry of the United States into WWI, and to brief and direct President Woodrow Wilson. From a somewhat crude beginning at Wellington House, grew an organization that was to shape the destiny of Germany, Britain, and more especially the United States in a manner that became a highly sophisticated organization to manipulate and create public opinion, what is commonly termed mass brainwashing. During the course of its development, Tavistock expanded in size and ambition, when in 1937, a decision was made to use the German author Oswald Spengler's monumental work, Untergang der Landes, The Decline of Western Civilization, as a model. Previously, Wellington House board members Rockmere, Northcliffe, Lippmann, and Bernays had read and proposed as a guide the writings of Correa Moylan Walsh, in particular, the book The Climax of Civilization, 1917, as corresponding closely to conditions that had to be created before a new world order in a one-world government could be ushered in. In this endeavor, the members of the board consulted with the British royal family and obtained the approval of the Olympians, the inner core of the Committee of 300, to formulate a strategy. Funding was provided by the monarchy, the Rothschilds, the Miller Group and the Rockefeller Family Trusts. In 1936, Spengler's monumental work had come to the attention of what had become the Tavistock Institute. In preparation for changing and reshaping public opinion for the second time in less than 12 years, by unanimous consent of the board, Spengler's massive book was adopted as the blueprint for a new working model to bring about the decline and fall of Western civilization necessary to create and establish a new world order inside a one-world government. Spengler held it bound to happen that alien elements would be introduced into Western civilization in increasing numbers, and that the West would fail at that time to expel the aliens, thereby sealing its fate, a society whose inward beliefs and sound convictions would become at variance with its outward profession, and thus Western civilization would fall by the wayside in the manner of the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. Tavistock thinking was that Spengler had indoctrinated Western civilization to believe that it would err on the side of Roman civilization, and expel the aliens. The genetic loss that has fallen upon Europe and especially on Scandinavia, England, Germany, France, the Anglo-Saxon, Nordic Alpine Germanic races, that began just before the Second World War is already so great as to be beyond expectations, and continues at an alarming pace under the skilled guidance of the Tavistock managers. was a very rare instance became a common occurrence, a black man married to a white woman or vice versa. The two world wars cost the German nation almost 1/4 of its population. Most of the intellectual energies of the German nation were diverted into war channels in defense of the fatherland at the expense of science, arts, literature, music, and the cultural, spiritual and moral advancement of the nation. The same could be said of the British nation. The blaze kindled by the British under the direction of Tavistock set all of Europe on fire, and did incalculable damage according to the Tavistock blueprint that matched Spengler's predictions. Classical and Western are the only two civilizations that could bring a modern renaissance to the world. They had flourished and progressed just as long as these civilizations remained under the control of the Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, Alpine, Germanic races. The unsurpassed beauty of their literature, art, their classics, spiritual and moral advancement of the female sex with a very large corresponding degree of protection, was what distinguished Western and classic civilizations from others. It was this bastion that Spengler saw coming under increasing attack, and the thinking at Tavistock ran on parallel tracks, but with a totally different goal. Tavistock saw this civilization as a stumbling block to ushering a new world order, as did the emphasis on protection and elevation of the female sex to a place of high respect and honor. Thus the whole thrust of Tavistock was to democratize the West by an attack on womanhood, and the racial, moral, spiritual, and religious foundation upon which Western civilization rested. As Spengler suggested, the Greeks and Romans were devoted to the social, religious, moral, and spiritual advancement and the preservation of womanhood, and they were successful for just as long as they were in control and could arrange matters so that government was carried out by a limited number of responsible citizens supported by the general populace below them, all being of the same pure unadulterated race. The planners at Tavistock saw that the way to upset the balance of Western civilization was to force unwelcome changes in the race by removing control from the deserving.
Just trying to, I found the book Tavistock on archive.org, so I figured I'd play the first chapter to some trippy music and shit, just in case anyone wanted to listen to it. If they don't, at least they can get stoned and fucking listen to it. But this is shit people gotta fucking hear. So that's what I'm up to, yo.
To the undeserving in the manner of ancient Roman leaders who were supplanted by their former slaves and aliens, who they had permitted to come and dwell among them. Tavistock, by 1937, had come a long way from its Wellington House beginnings and the successful propaganda campaign that had turned the British public from being strongly anti-war in 1913 to willing participants through the arts of manipulation with the willing cooperation of news communications media. The technique was carried across the Atlantic in 1916 to manipulate the American people to support of the war in Europe. In spite of the fact that the vast majority, including at least 50 U.S. senators, were adamantly opposed to the U.S. getting dragged into what they perceived was essentially a quarrel between Britain and France on the one hand, and Germany on the other, largely over trade and economics, the conspirators were undeterred. At that point, Wellington House introduced the word isolationists as a derogatory description of those Americans who opposed U.S. participation in the war. The use of such words and phrases has proliferated under the expert brainwashing of the social sciences scientists at Tavistock. Terms like regime change, collateral damage became almost new English language. With the Tavistock Plan modified to suit American conditions, Bemis and Lippmann led President Woodrow Wilson to set up the very first Tavistock methodology techniques for polling, manufacturing, so-called public opinion created by Tavistock propaganda. They also taught Wilson to set up a secret body of managers to run the war effort and a body of advisors to assist the president in his decision-making. The Creel Commission was the first such body of opinion makers set up in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to publicly proclaim himself in favor of a socialist New World Order inside a socialist one-world government. His remarkable acceptance of the New World Order is found in his book The New Freedom. We say his book, but actually, it was written by socialist William B. Hale. Wilson denounced capitalism. It is contrary to the common man and it has brought stagnation to our economy, Wilson wrote. Yet, at the time, the United States economy was enjoying prosperity and industrial expansion as it had never experienced before in its history. We stand in the presence of a revolution, not a bloody Revolution. America is not given to spilling blood but a silent revolution, whereby America will insist upon recovering to practice those ideals which she has always professed, upon securing a government devoted to the general and not the special interests. We are upon the threshold of a time when the systematic life of the country will be sustained or at least supplemented at every point by government activity. And now we have to determine what kind of a government activity it shall be, whether, in the first place, it shall be directed from government itself, or whether it shall be indirect, through instrumentalities which have already constituted themselves and which stand ready to supersede government. While the U.S. was still a neutral power under the Wilson presidency, Wellington House poured out a cadence of lies about Germany, and what a threat it was to America. We are reminded of the statement made by Bakunin in 1814 as it tightened so well with the outrageous propaganda that Wilson made use of to bolster his case, lying by diplomacy. Diplomacy has no other mission. Every time a state wants to declare war upon another state, it starts off by launching a manifesto addressed not only to its own subjects but also to the whole world. In this manifesto it declares that right and justice are on its side and endeavors to prove that it is actuated by love of peace and humanity, and democracy, and that, imbued with generous and peaceful sentiments, it suffered for a long time in silence until mounting iniquity of its enemy forced it to bear its sword. At the same time it vows that, disdainful of all material conquest and not seeking any increase in territory, it will put an end to this war as soon as justice is re-established. And its antagonists answer with a similar manifesto, in which, naturally, right, justice and humanity and all generous sentiments are to be found respectively on its side. These mutually opposed manifestos are written with the same eloquence, they breathe the same righteous indignation, and one is just as sincere as the other, that is to say they are both brazen in their lies, and it is only fools who are deceived by them. Sensible persons, all those who have some political experience, do not even take the trouble of reading such manifestos. President Wilson's statements just before he went to the Congress to request a constitutional declaration of war embodies every one of Bakunin's sentiments. He was lying by diplomacy, and he used the gross propaganda manufactured at Wellington House to inflame the American public by tales of atrocities committed by the German army in its march across Belgium in 1914. As we shall discover, it was, for the most part, a gigantic lie passed off as truth. I remember looking through a large stack of old newspapers at the British Museum where I spent 5 years doing in-depth research. The papers covered the years 1912 to 1920. I recall thinking at the time, isn't it amazing that the rush to the New World Order socialist totalitarian government should be led by the United States, supposedly a bastion of freedom? Then, as I recall, it came to me with great clarity that the Committee of 300 has its people at the highest and lowest echelons embedded in the U.S., in banking, industry, trade, defense, the State Department, and indeed in the very White House, not to mention the elite club called the U.S. Senate, which in my view is a forum for pushing the New World Order. I recall thinking that President Wilson's propaganda blast against Germany and the Kaiser, actually the product of Rothschild agents Lords Northcliffe and Rockmere, and the Wellington House propaganda factory, was not much different to the contrived situation of Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and looking back now I can see no difference between the propaganda lies about the brutality of German soldiers allegedly chopping off the arms and legs of little Belgian children in 1914, than the methods used to get the American people duped and doped into allowing the Bush administration to invade Iraq. Whereas in 1914 it was the Kaiser who was a brute savage, a ruthless murderer, a monster, the butcher of Berlin. In 2002 it was President Hussein who was all of these things and a whole lot more, including the butcher of Baghdad. Poor duped, deluded, deceived, connived, trustful America. When will you ever learn? In 1917 the New World Order agenda was being rushed through the House and Senate by Woodrow Wilson, and President Bush forced the New World Order agenda for Iraq through the House and Senate in 2002 without debate, an exercise in arbitrary power and a gross violation of the U.S. Constitution for which the American people are paying a huge price. But the American people are suffering from toxic shock induced by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and the American people are in a state of sleepwalking and without leadership. They do not know what the price is and do not care to find out. The Committee of 300 continues to rule the United States, just as it did in the Wilson and Roosevelt presidencies, while the American people were distracted with bread and circuses. Only today it is baseball, football, endless Hollywood, and Social Security. Nothing has changed. The United States, harried, hounded, pushed and shoved, is headed of a fast track to the New World Order, propelled along by the radical Republicans of the War Party, who have been taken over by the scientists at the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Just recently I was asked by a subscriber, where do we find the Tavistock Institute? My response was, look around the US Senate, the House of Representatives, the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, Wall Street, Fox TV, Faux TV, and you will see their change agents in every one of these places. President Wilson was the first U.S. president to manage the war through a civilian committee guided and directed by the Beavis and Lippmann from Wellington House, to which we have already made mention. The resounding success of Wellington House and its enormous influence on the course of American history began before that in 1913. Wilson had spent almost a year tearing down the protective trade tariffs that had defended the American domestic markets from being overwhelmed by free trade, essentially the practice of allowing cheap British goods made with cheap labor in India to flood the American market. On October 12, 1913, Wilson signed a bill that was the beginning of the end of the unique American middle class, long the target of the Fabian socialists. The bill was described as a measure to adjust tariffs, but it would have been accurate to describe it as a bill to destroy tariffs. Such was the hidden power of Wellington House that the vast majority of the American people accepted this lie, not knowing or realizing that it was a death knell for American commerce that would lead to NAFTA, GET, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. Even more astonishing was the acceptance of the Federal Income Tax Act that was passed on September 5, 1913, to replace trade tariffs as the source of revenue for the federal government. Income tax is a Marxist doctrine not found in the U.S. Constitution any more than the Federal Reserve Bank is found in the Constitution. Wilson called his twin blows against the Constitution a fight for the people and for free business, and said he was proud to have taken part in the completion of a great piece of business. The Federal Reserve Act, explained by Wilson as reconstructing the nation's banking and currency system, was rushed through on a flood tide of propaganda emanating from Wellington House, just in time for the hostilities that began the horror of WWI. Most historians are agreed that without passage of the Federal Reserve Bank Act, Fort Gray would not have been able to start that terrible conflagration. The deceptive language of the Federal Reserve Act was under the guidance of Beavis and Lippmann, who set up a National Citizens League with the notorious Samuel Untermeyer as its chairman, to promote the Federal Reserve Bank, that secured control of the people's money and currency and transferred it to a private monopoly without the victim's consent. One of the most interesting pieces of history surrounding the imposition of the foreign financial slavery measure was that before it was sent to Wilson for his signature, a copy was given to the sinister Colonel Edward Mondell House as the representative of Wellington House and the British oligarchy represented by the banker, J.P. Morgan. As to the American people, in whose name the disastrous measure was instituted, they had not the faintest idea how they had been connived, cheated, lied to, and utterly deceived. An instrument of slavery was fastened around their necks without the victims ever becoming aware of it. Wellington House methodology was at its height when Wilson was coached in how to persuade Congress to declare war on Germany, although he had won election on a solemn promise to keep America out of the war then raging in Europe, a great triumph for the new art of public opinion making. It was just that the poll questions were shaded in such a way that the answers reflected the opinions of the public, not their understanding of the questions, nor their understanding of the processes of political science. A thorough search and reading of the congressional records from 1910 to 1920 by this writer showed very clearly that had Wilson not signed the iniquitous Currency Reform Bill on December 23, 1913, the upper-level parallel secret government of the United States foretold by H.G. Wells would not have been able to commit the vast resources of the United States to the war in Europe. The House of Morgan, representing the Olympians of the Committee of 300, and its all-powerful City of London financial nexus, played a leading role in shaping the U.S. Federal Reserve banks, which were neither federal nor banks, but a private money-generating monopoly fastened around the necks of the American people, whose money was now free to be stolen on an unimaginable scale, making them slaves of the New World Order inside the coming one-world government. The Great Depression of the 1930s was the second major catastrophic bill the American people had to pay, the first being World War I. See Appendix. Those who read this book as a first introduction to the New World Order inside a one-world government will be skeptical, but consider that no less a personage than the great Sir Harold Mackinder did not hide his beliefs about its coming. More than that, he gave notice that it might be a dictatorship. Sir Harold had an impressive resume, CV, having been Professor of Geography at the University of London, a Director of the London School of Economics from 1903 to 1908 and a Member of Parliament from 1910 to 1922. He was also a close associate of Arnold Toynbee, one of the leading lights at Wellington House. He had correctly predicted a core of startling geopolitical events, many of them actually coming to pass. One such prophecy was the founding of two Germanys, the Social Democratic Republic of Germany and the Federal Republic of Germany. Critics suggested that he got the information from Toynbee, that it was merely the long-range planning of the Committee of 300 that Toynbee knew about. After Wellington House, Toynbee moved to the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA, and then to London University, where he held a chair for international history. In his book, America and World Revolution, he said, "If we are to avoid mass suicide, we must have our world state quickly, and this probably means that we must have it in a non-democratic form to begin with. We will have to start building a world state now on the best design that is practicable at the moment." Toynbee went on in a forthright manner, saying this world dictatorship would have to supplant the local national states which litter the present political map. The new world state was to be brought about on the basis of mass mind control and propaganda that would make it acceptable. I explained in my book, The Committee of 300, that Bernays blew the whistle on polling in his 1923 and 1928 books, Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion. This was followed by engineering consent, self-preservation, ambition, pride, hunger, love of family and children, patriotism, imitativeness, the desire to be a leader, love of play. These and other drives are the psychological raw materials which every leader must take into account in his endeavor to win the public to his point of view. To maintain their self-assurance, most people need to feel certain that whatever they believe about anything is true. These revealing works are examined, and we should add that in writing them, the Tavistock hierarchy apparently felt secure enough to gloat over their control of the United States and Great Britain that had blossomed into an open conspiracy, along the lines first suggested by H.G. Wells. With the advent of Wellington House, funded by the British monarchy and later by Rockefeller, Rothschild, and the United States, Western civilization entered into the first phase of a plan that would provide a secret government to rule the world, namely, the Committee of 300. Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was its creation. As this book is not about the Committee of 300, we would suggest that readers obtain copies of the first and second book, The Committee of 300. The 300's carefully structured blueprint has been followed to the letter, and today, as we reach the end of 2005, looking back, it is fairly easy for knowledgeable persons to trace the course that was laid out for Western civilization and to mark its progression to the point where we are today. This book is an attempt to do just that. Chapter 1, founding the world's premier brainwashing institute. From its modest but vitally important beginning at Wellington House, the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations expanded rapidly to become the world's premier top-secret brainwashing institute. How this rapid progression was accomplished needs to be explained. The modern science of mass manipulation of public opinion was born at Wellington House, founded, the lusty infant being midwifed by Ford Northcliffe and Ford Rockmere. The British monarchy, Ford Rothschild, and the Rockefellers were responsible for funding the venture. The papers we were privileged to examine showed that the purpose of those at Wellington House was to effect a change in the opinion of the British people, who were adamantly opposed to war with Germany, a formidable task that was accomplished by opinion making through polling. The staff consisted of Arnold Toynbee, a future Director of Studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, Ford's Northcliffe, and the Americans, Walter Pitman and Edward Bemis. Bemis was born in Vienna on November 22, 1891. As the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, regarded by many as the father of public relations, although the title properly belongs to Willy Munzenberg. Beavis pioneered the use of psychology and other social sciences to shape and form public opinion so that the public thought such manufactured opinions were their own. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. Bernays postulated. He called this technique engineering consent. One of his best-known techniques of achieving this goal was the indirect use of what he called third-party authorities to shape the desired opinions. If you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. This technique he called opinion-making. Perhaps we can now begin to understand how it was that Wilson, Roosevelt, Clinton, Bush the elder and the younger could so easily lead America into disastrous wars in which its people should never have become involved. The joint British and American participants concentrated their efforts on techniques as yet not tried out, to mobilize support for the war looming on the horizon. As previously stated, the British people did not want war, and said so, but Toynbee, Lippmann and Beavis expected to change that by applying techniques designed to manipulate public opinion through the use of polling. Herein we provide a review of the methods that were devised and executed to bring Great Britain and the United States into the First World War, plus the techniques that were put into practice between the two world wars and beyond. As will be seen, propaganda was to play a major role. One of the main objectives at Tavistock was to achieve the degradation of women. Tavistock recognized that Jesus Christ has brought a new place of respect in the order of civilization to womanhood, which prior to his coming had not been present. After Christ's ministry, womanhood gained a respect and a high place in society absent from pre-Christian civilizations. Of course, it can be argued that such an elevated status existed in the Greek and Roman empires, and that would be true to a certain extent, but not to the extent that womanhood was elevated in post-Christ society. Tavistock sought to change that, and the process began immediately after WWI. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which the Rus, Viking, princes of Moscow brought back from Constantinople, revered and respected womanhood, and their experience with the Khazarians, whom they subsequently defeated and drove out of Russia, left them determined to protect womanhood in Russia. The founder of the Romanov dynasty, Michael Romanov, was the scion of a noble family that had defended Russia on the basis of a Christian country. From 1613 the Romanovs sought to ennoble Russia and imbue it with a great spirit of Christianity, which meant also protection for and the honoring of Russian womanhood. The princes of Moscow under Prince Dmitry Donskoy earned the unremitting hatred of the Rothschilds for Russia because of Donskoy's defeat and expulsion of the Khazarian hordes that inhabited the lower regions of the Volga. This barbaric warrior nation of mysterious Indo-Turk origin had adopted the Judaic religion on passage of a decree by King Bulan after the religion was approved by the chief Khazarian soothsayer magician sorcerer, David Lroi. It was Lroi's personal flag, now called the Star of David, that became the official flag of the Khazarian nation when they settled in Poland after being forced out of Russia. The flag was adopted by the Zionists as their standard and is still mistakenly called the Star of David. Christians make the error of confusion linking it with the Old Testament King David, when in fact there is no relation between the two. The hatred of Russia was compounded in 1612 when the Romanov dynasty led a Russian army against Poland, taking back large parts of Poland that had formerly belonged to Russia. The principal architect of enmity brought to bear against Russia was the Rothschild dynasty, and it was this burning hatred that Tavistock used and channeled in its plan to destroy Western civilization. The first opportunity created by Tavistock came in 1905 with the attack by the Japanese Navy that completely surprised the Russian fleet. The exercise was Ban Kral by Jacob Schiff, the Wall Street banker, who was related to Rothschild. The defeat of the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in his surprise attack marked the beginning of the pall of gloom that was about to roll in over Christian Europe. The Rockefeller Standard Oil Group, directed by Tavistock and with the aid of the 300, engineered the Russo-Japanese War. The money used to finance the operation came from Jacob Schiff, but was actually provided by the Rockefeller General Education Board, whose outward purpose was to finance Negro education. All of the propaganda and advertising for the board was written and crafted by the social scientists at Tavistock, which was then called Wellington House. In 1941, another Rockefeller Front organization, the Institute for Pacific Relations, IPR, gave large sums to its Japanese counterpart in Tokyo. The money was then funneled to a member of the imperial family by Richard Zargin, a Russian master spy, for the purposes of inducing Japan to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Again, Tavistock was the originator of all of IPR's publications. Although it was not yet evident, as Spengler was to mention in his monumental work, published in 1936, it marked the beginning of the end of the old order. Contrary to most establishment accounts of history, the Russian Revolution was not a Russian Revolution at all, but a foreign ideology backed primarily by the Committee of 300 and its arm, the Tavistock Institute, that was violently forced upon a startled, unprepared and dismayed Romanov family. It was political warfare, low-grade warfare and psychological warfare in which Tavistock had become well-versed. As Winston Churchill was to remark, they transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia, and then once established, Lenin and Trotsky seized Russia by the hair of its head. Much has been written, but nearly always in passing as if it is a mere postscript to history, about the sealed truck, sealed car, sealed train, that transported Lenin and his Bolshevik revolutionaries safely through the midst of wartime Europe and deposited them in Russia, there to begin their imported Bolshevik revolution so mistakenly termed the Russian Revolution. Documents the author was privileged to study at Wellington House, and what was revealed in the Arnold Toynbee papers and Bruce Lockhart's private papers led to the conclusion that without Toynbee, Bruce Lockhart of MI6 British intelligence, and without the complicity of at least 5 European nations, ostensibly loyal and friendly with the court at St. Petersburg, the merciless Bolshevik Revolution would have been still bombed. As this account must of necessity be limited to Tavistock's participation in the affair, it will not be as a complete account of the skullduggery we would like to have presented. According to Miller's private papers, his aides through Tavistock contacted a fellow socialist, Fritz Planin. Miller was a leading Fabian socialist, although he scorned Sidney and Beatrice Webb. It was Planin who planned the logistics of the trip and oversaw it until the revolutionaries arrived in Petrograd. This was confirmed and borne out by the Wilhelmstrasse files, the majority of which we were able to gain access to, which files were open to certain people qualified to read them. They tallied fairly closely with Bruce Lockhart's account in his private papers, as well as what Ford Alfred Miller had to say about the underhand affair that betrayed Russia. It appeared that Miller had many contacts among the Bolshevik expatriates, among them Finnan. It was to Ford Miller that Finnan went when he needed money for the revolution. Armed with a letter of introduction from Planin, Finnan met with Ford Miller and laid down his plan for the overthrow of the Romanovs and Christian Russia. Miller agreed on condition that he could send his agent Bruce Lockhart of MI6 to supervise the day-to-day affairs and report back on Finnan. Lord Rothschild and the Rockefellers demanded that they be allowed to send Sidney Riley to Russia to supervise transfer of Russia's natural resources and the gold rubles held in the central bank to London. This was agreed to by Lenin, and later Trotsky. To seal the bargain, Lord Miller, on behalf of the Rothschilds, gave Lenin £60 million in gold sovereigns, while the Rockefellers contributed around $40 million. Countries in complicity with the sealed train affair were Great Britain, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, and Sweden. While the United States was not directly involved, it must have been aware of what was going on. After all, on the orders of President Wilson, a brand new American passport was issued to Leon Trotsky, whose real name was Lev Bronstein, so that he could travel in peace, although Trotsky was not a U.S. citizen. Lenin and his compatriots were provided with a private, well-appointed rail carriage by the top German government functionaries and always kept locked by agreements with stations along the line. Planin was in charge, and he laid down the rules for the trip, some of which are listed in the Wilhelmstrasse files. The carriage was to remain locked for the entire trip. No one could board the carriage without Planin's permission. The train would have extraterritorial status. No passports were to be asked at borders. Tickets would be bought at regular prices. No security issues to be raised by the military or police of any country en route. According to the Wilhelmstrasse files, the trip was authorized and approved by General Ludendorff and Kaiser Wilhelm. Ludendorff went so far as to say that if Sweden refused to let the Bolsheviks pass, he would guarantee them passage into Russia through the German lines. As it turned out, the Swedish government raised no objection, and neither did the Finnish government. One of the notable revolutionaries, who joined the train when it arrived at the German frontier with Switzerland, was Radek, who was to play a leading role in the bloody Bolshevik Revolution. There were some lighter moments too. The Wilhelmstrasse files describe how the carriage missed its engine at Frankfurt, resulting in it being shunted to and fro for about 8 hours. The party had to detrain in the German Baltic town of Sassnitz, where they were accorded decent accommodation by the German government. The Swedish government kindly gave them ferry transport to Malmö, from where they sailed to Stockholm, where nice accommodation awaited the Bolshevik party for an overnight layover, and then it was on to the Finnish border. There, the intrepid Platon left the high-spirited party, and the final journey into Russia was made by train to Petrograd. Thus an epic journey that began in Zurich, Switzerland, ended in Petrograd. Lenin had arrived on the scene, and Russia was about to be brought low. And throughout, Bemis and Lippmann and their associates at Wellington House, Tavistock, kept up a steady flow of brainwashing propaganda that it is safe to conclude, duped much of the Europe falls off the precipice. 9 Europe after WWI and the close of the Bolshevik Revolution was forced to change according to the Tavistock blueprint. When, thanks to the British engendered and instigated First World War, Europe fell off a precipice into the end of their world, or perhaps it might be more appropriate to say, shambled along like zombies until the last of the era vanished into the darkness of the abyss, the forced changes became very much apparent. This is not a book about the First World War per se. Hundreds of thousands of words have been written about the cause and effects of the greatest tragedy ever to befall mankind, and yet it has not been adequately addressed and probably never will be. One thing that many writers, myself included, are agreed on. The war was started by Great Britain out of sheer hatred of Germany's rapid progress toward becoming a major economic power in competition against Britain, and Lord Edward Grey was the principal architect of the war. That it was unpopular and not approved of by a large majority of the British people called for special measures and a new department to handle the challenge. In essence, that is the reason why Wellington House came into existence. From such a small beginning, it progressed into the gargantuan Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, by 2005, the world's premier brainwashing institution and a most sinister force. That it will have to be confronted and put out of business if the United States is to survive as a constitutional republic with a republican form of government guaranteed to the 50 states is the considered opinion of a number of members of the U.S. Senate, who were consulted in preparation for this book, but who asked not to be named. The aftermath of the First World War and the failed attempts to form a League of Nations served only to emphasize the gap between the old Western civilization and the new. The economic disaster of post-war Germany hung like the smoke from a funeral pyre over Western culture, adding to the dismal, sad, and fearful climate that began in the 1920s. Historians agree that all of the combatants suffered economic ravage of varying degree, although Russia was somewhat spared, only to be destroyed by the Bolsheviks, while Germany and Austria were the hardest hit. A strange kind of a forced gaiety descended on Europe in the 1920s, in which I include Britain and the United States. It was put down to rebellious youth and people generally being sick of war and politics. In point of fact, people were reacting to the long-range penetration and interdirectional conditioning of the masters at Tavistock. In the period between the end of WWI and 1935, they were as much shell-shocked as were the troops who had survived the hell of the trenches with shot and shell flying all around them, only now, it was economic shot and shell and vast changes in social mores that numbed their senses. But the end result of the treatment was the same. People threw discretion to the winds, and the moral rot that was set in motion in 1918 is ongoing and gathering momentum. In the state of forced gaiety, nobody saw the coming of the world economic crash and subsequent world depression. It is agreed by most historians that this condition was engineered, and we are led to believe that Tavistock played a role in the feverish publicity campaigns of various factions in that period. In support of our contention that the crash and depression was a contrived event, see Appendix of Events. Spengler foretold what was to happen, and as it turns out, his predictions were amazingly accurate. Decadent society and loose women characterized by the flappers, and men in coats fitted with hip flasks, who demanded and got a lessening of female modesty that came in with higher hemlines, bobbed hair, and excessive makeup, women smoking and drinking in public. As money became harder to come by and soup kitchen and unemployment lines grew longer, hemlines grew shorter, while the writings of Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, and D.H. Lawrence Drew gasps, the latest Broadway shows and nightclub acts revealed a lot more of women's hidden charms than ever before, and put them out on public display. It was noted by fashion designers in 1919 in a New Yorker magazine that hemlines this year are 6 inches from the ground and very daring. How times were made to change 13, but that was only the beginning. In 1935, with Hitler rising to power, guaranteed by the impossible conditions forced upon Germany at Versailles, hemlines were also rising to the dizzy height of the knees, except in Germany, where Hitler was demanding modesty from German womanhood and getting it, along with wholesome respect, which did not suit Tavistock's book. People who stopped to think at all said they hated the way times are changing, but what they did not and could not know was that times were being made to change according to a carefully laid out Tavistock formula. Everywhere else in Europe and America the revolt was on as emancipation fever spread. In the United States it was silent screen idols who led the way, but this was no match with what was happening in Europe, where every single pleasure was being indulged in, including homosexuality, that had long been hidden in darkness and never mentioned in polite society. Homosexuality emerged alongside lesbianism to shock disgust, and it seemed, to deliberately affront those who still lingered in the old order. A study of this aberration showed that homosexuality and lesbianism became rampant not out of any inner or latent desires, but as a means to shocking the old establishment with its rigid codes of good order. Music too suffered and went to the dogs in all manner of jazz and other decadent. Tavistock was now in the most crucial stage of developing its plan that called for womanhood to be reduced to a lessening standard of morality and of feminine behavior never thought possible. Nations were in a state of numbness, shell-shocked by the radical changes forced upon them which seemed impossible to stop, in which a complete absence of female modesty reflected in learned behavioral attitudes that made the 1920s and 1930s look like a ladies' Sunday school teachers' convention. There was no stopping the sexual revolution that swept the world during that era and the planned degradation of womanhood that went with it. Some voices were heard, notably G.K. Chesterton and Oswald Spengler, but it was not enough to blunt the assault launched by the Tavistock Institute that had in effect declared war on Western civilization. The effects of long-range penetration and interdirectional conditioning were everywhere to be observed. The moral, spiritual, racial, economic, cultural, and intellectual bankruptcy we are in the midst of today is not some social phenomenon or the result of something abstract or sociological that just happened. Rather, it was the outcome of a carefully planned Tavistock program. What we are seeing is not accidental, some aberration of history. Rather, it is the end product of a deliberately induced social and moral crisis evident everywhere and in such personages as Mick Jagger, Oprah Winfrey, Britney Spears, reality television shows, music seemingly an amalgam of every base instinct, Fox News, phone news, near pornographic movies in mainstream theaters, advertising in which modesty and decency are cast to the winds, loud uncouth behavior in public places, especially in American restaurants, Katie Curie and a host other of female non-entities suddenly created to become highly paid television anchors or talk show hosts, all of whom have been trained to talk in a hard, grating monotonous voices totally lacking in cadence, as if talking through clenched jaws, in a manner that is harsh, strident, and hard on the ears. Whereas television news readers and anchormen had always been men, suddenly, there were no more than a dozen men in the field. We see it in non-entity stars in the movie industry that chum out movies of an increasingly low cultural standard. We see it also in the glorification of interracial marriages, divorce on demand, abortion, and blatant homosexual and lesbian behavior, in the loss of religious beliefs and in Western civilization family life. Such stars are Ellen DeGeneres, who have absolutely no talent and nothing of any cultural value to offer, are held up as models for impressionable young girls who are increasingly on parade with as much as 75% of their bodies exposed. We see it in a massive increase in drug addiction and all manner of social evil, as in Canada passing a law making homosexual and lesbian marriage legal under the threadbare guise of civil rights. We see it in wholesale corruption of the political system and constitutional mayhem where the House and Senate permits flagrant violations of the highest law in the land, at every level of government, and nowhere more so than in the executive branch of government, where every president since Roosevelt has taken powers to which the president is not entitled. We see it in the illicit taking of war powers by the president when such powers are explicitly denied to the executive by the U.S. Constitution. We see it in a new dimension of constitutional disobedience added to an ugly list of laws not empowered by the Constitution, one of the most recent and most shocking being the U.S. Supreme Court's blatant exceeding of its powers in breaking down states' rights and electing George Bush, the younger, as the president. This had to be one of the most savage blows struck against the Constitution and the grossest contravention of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in the history of the United States. Yet, so dazed and shell-shocked are the American people that no protest was voiced, no mass demonstrations, no calls for the Supreme Court to be reined in. In this one incident alone, the power of Tavistock's long-range penetration and interdirectional conditioning proved to be a huge triumph. No, this condition of disintegration of our republic in which we find ourselves in 2005 did not simply evolve, rather it is the end product of a carefully planned social engineering brainwashing project of immense proportions. The truth is reflected in the death throes of what was once the greatest nation on earth. The physiological conditioning papers written by the social scientists at Tavistock are working well. Your reaction is a program one. You cannot think in any other way unless you make a supreme effort. Nor can you take steps to free yourself from this condition unless you can first identify the enemy and his plan for the dissolution of the United States and Europe in particular and the Western world in general. That enemy is called the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, and it has been at war with Western civilization since its earliest days before it found form and substance at Wellington House and from there evolved into its present facilities at Sussex University and the Tavistock Clinic in London. Before I unmasked this institution in 1969, it was unknown in the United States. It is without doubt the world's premier brainwashing social engineering establishment. We shall see what it achieved in its early days in pre-WWI England and since then in the run-up to World War II and post-World War II to the present time. During World War II, the Tavistock Institute was headquartered at the British Army Physiological Warfare Division. We have covered its history during its formative years at Wellington House, and we now proceed to the pre-World War II and post-World War II activities. Social engineering and the social scientists. 19. Drive. Kurt Lewin was its chief theoretician who specialized in the teaching and application of topological psychology, which was and remains the most advanced method of behavior modification. Lewin was assisted by Major General John Rawlings Rees, Eric Trist, W.R. Byron, H.B. Dix, and several of the greats of brainwashing and social engineering like Margaret Mead and her husband, Gregory Bateson. Bemis was the top consultant right up to the time George Bush was placed in the White House by the Supreme Court. We do not want to get too technical and thus will not get into specifics of how they applied the social scientists' sciences. Most will accept the generic term of brainwashing as an overall explanation of the activities of this, the mother of all think tanks. It will come as no small surprise to learn that Lewin and his team founded the Stanford Research Center, the Wharton School of Economics, MIT, and the National Institute of Mental Health, among scores of other institutions fondly believed to be American institutions. During the course of years, the federal government contributed millions upon millions of dollars to Tavistock and its expanded web of interlinking institutions, while corporate America and Wall Street came up with matching amounts. We make bold to say that without the amazing growth and advances techniques for mass brainwashing developed by the Tavistock Institute, there would have been no Second World War, nor any of the wars that followed, and certainly not the two Gulf Wars, the second of which is still raging in November 2005. By the year 2000 there was hardly any aspect of life in America into which Tavistock's tentacles had not reached, and that included every level of government from local to federal, industry, trade, education, and the political institutions of the nation. Every mental and psychological aspect of the nation was analyzed, recorded, profiled and stored in computer memory banks.
No conspiracies
What
here,
has
boys.
come out of this is what Tavistock calls a three-system response, and it is how population groups react to stress resulting from contrived situations that become crisis management exercises. What we have in the US and Britain is a government that creates a situation viewed by its citizens as a crisis, and government then manages that crisis. An example of a contrived situation was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was contrived as previously explained herein, with a transfer of Rockefeller cash to Richard Czar, the master spy, and then to a member of the imperial family to prompt Japan to fire the first shots so that the Roosevelt administration could take the United States into World War II. The economic strangulation of Japan by Britain and the United States unilaterally choking off the flow of essential raw materials to the island factory that was Japan, had reached a point where a decision was made to put an end to it. Tavistock played an enormous role in crafting the massive wave of anti-Japanese propaganda that swept the United States into the war in Europe via war against Japan. Unbearable economic pressure was put on Japan, while at the same time the Roosevelt administration refused to negotiate, until the Tokyo government could see no way out but to attack at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had conveniently obligingly shifted the Pacific Fleet into harm's way by moving it from its safe haven at San Diego to Pearl Harbor, for absolutely no valid or strategic reason, thereby placing it squarely in reach of the Japanese Navy. Another example is more recent, the Gulf War that began when a hue and a cry was raised about Iraq's alleged stocks of nuclear and chemical weapons, the so-called weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. The Bush administration and the Blair government knew the issue was a contrived situation without foundation or merit. They knew that there were no such weapons. Indisputable proof existed that Hussein's weapons program had been nullified after the 1991 Gulf War and through continued brutal sanctions. In short, the two Western leaders were caught out in a web of lies, yet such is the power of the Committee of 300 and the brainwashing power of Tavistock, that they remained in office, although it is an accepted fact that because of their lies, at least 1 million Iraqis and more than 2,000 American servicemen dead and 25,999 wounded. Russia's GRU military intelligence figures, of which 53% are maimed, with the cost in monetary terms as of October 2005 exceeding $550 billion. The Iraqi death toll is the total of both Gulf Wars, of which the majority are civilians who died from the lack of food, clean water, and medicine as a result of the criminal sanctions imposed by the British and US governments under cover of the UN. In carrying out sanctions against Iraq, the UN violated its own charter and from then on became a crippled institution lacking credibility. There is no parallel in history where a man holding the highest office was proved to be a liar and deceiver and yet could remain in power as if nothing had stained his office. A state of affairs that demonstrates the power of the Tavistock Institute's long-range penetration and inner conditioning treatment of the American people, that would cause them docilely to accept such a turgid, horror-filled situation without ever taking to the streets in rage. Well, did Henry Ford say that people deserve the government they get if the people do nothing to turn that government out of office, such as is the right of the American people under their U.S. Constitution? Then they deserve to have liars and deceivers running their nation and their lives. On the other hand, the American people may well be going through the one of the three phases of what Dr. Fred Emery, at one time the senior psychiatrist at Tavistock, once described as social environmental turbulence. According to Emery, large populations groups manifest the following symptoms when subjected to conditions of violent social changes, stress, and turbulence, which can be divided into well-defined categories. Superficiality is the condition that manifests itself when the threatened population group reacts by adopting shallow sloganeering, which they attempt to pass off as ideals. Very little ego investment takes place, making the first phase a maladaptive response because, as Emery stated, the cause of the crisis is not isolated and identified, and the crisis intention is not abated, but continues for as long as the controller wanted to last. The second phase of the crisis reaction, since the crisis is continuing, is fragmentation, a condition in which panic strikes, social cohesion falls apart, with the result that very small groups form and attempt to protect themselves from the crisis with little or no regard for the expense or cost to other fragmented, small groups. This phase Emery calls passive maladaptation, while still failing to identify the cause of the crisis. The third phase is when the victims turn away from the source of the induced crisis and the resulting tension. They take fantasy trips of internal migration, introspection, and obsession with self. This is what Tavistock calls disassociation and self-realization. Emery goes on to explain that the passive maladaptation responses are now coupled with active maladaptive responses. Emery states that over the past 50 years that experiments in applied social psychology and resultant crisis management have taken over all aspects of life in America, and the results are stored in the computers in the major think tanks such as Stanford University. The scenarios are taken out, used and revised from time to time, and, according to Tavistock, the scenarios are in operation at the present time. Translated, this means that Tavistock has the majority of the American people profiled and brainwashed. If any part of the American public is ever able to identify the cause of the crises that have washed over this nation in the past 70 years, the social engineering structure built by Tavistock will come crashing down. But that has not yet happened. Tavistock continues to drown the American public in its sea of created public opinion. The social engineering developed by the social sciences scientists at Tavistock has been used as a weapon during this century's two world wars, especially World War I. The pollsters who developed it have been quite frank that they employ on the American population the same devices and methods used and experimented with against enemy populations. Today, the manipulation by polls of public opinion has become a central technique in the hands of the social engineers and controllers of the social scientists employed at Tavistock and its many think tanks located all over the United States and Britain. Chapter 5. Do we have what H.G. Wells called an invisible government? As I have previously related, the motive science of making public opinion through advanced techniques of manipulating mass opinion began at one of the West's most advanced propaganda factories situated in Britain at Wellington House. This facility, dedicated to social engineering and creating public opinion at the commencement of World War I, was under the aegis of Lords Rockmere and Northcliffe, and the future Director of Studies of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, Arnold Toynbee. Wellington House had an American section, whose most prominent members were Walter Lippmann and Edward Bemis. As we discovered later, Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, a fact carefully hidden from public view. Jointly, they centered work on techniques to mobilize support for World War I among the masses of people who were opposed to war with Germany. The public perception was that Germany was a friend of the British people, not an enemy, and the British people saw no need to fight Germany. After all, was it not true that Queen Victoria was the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II? Toynbee, Lippmann, and Bemis worked to persuade them that war was necessary, using the techniques of the news science through new arts of mass manipulation via the communications media for its propaganda purposes, tinged with willingness to lie, which was just getting into its stride, having learned a great deal of experience during the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. It was not only the British public whose perception of events had to be altered, but also a recalcitrant American public. To this end, Bernays and Lippmann were instrumental in getting Woodrow Wilson to establish the Creel Committee, which created the first body of methodological techniques for dissemination of successful propaganda and for the science of polling to secure the correct opinion. From the beginning, the techniques were designed in such a way that polling, public opinion making, was based on one obvious, but striking feature. It was concerned with people's opinions, not with their understanding of the processes of science. Thus, by intent, the pollsters elevated an essentially irrational element of mind to a primary level of public focus. This was a conscious decision to undermine the grasps of reality of masses of people in an increasingly complex industrial society. If you have ever watched Fox News, where viewers are given the results of a poll about what Americans are thinking, and then for the next hour found yourself shaking your head and wondering what the results of the poll reflected about your own thinking processes, then you could only have felt more puzzled than ever. The key to understanding Fox News and the poll might lie in what Lippmann had to say about such matters. In his 1922 book, Public Opinion, Lippmann outlined Tavistock's psychological warfare methodology. In an introductory chapter, The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads, Lippmann stressed that the object of study of the public opinion social analyst is reality as defined by internal perception or images of that reality. Public opinion deals with indirect, unseen, and puzzling facts, and there is nothing obvious about them. The situations to which public opinions refer are known only as opinions. The pictures inside the heads of these human beings, the pictures of themselves, of others, of their needs, purposes, and relationship, are their public opinions. Those pictures, which are acted upon by groups of people, or by individuals acting in the name of groups, are public opinion with capital letters. The picture inside so often misleads men in their dealings with the world outside. From this evaluation, it is easy to take the next decisive step made by Bemis, that the elites who run society can and do marshal the resources of mass communications to mobilize and alter the herd mind. 1 year after Litton's book, Bernays authored Crystallizing Public Opinion. He followed that in 1928 with a book entitled quite simply, Propaganda. In the first chapter, Organizing Chaos, Bemis wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men that we have never heard of. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. Whatever attitude one chooses to take toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction of our 120 million who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." In Propaganda, Bemis followed his praise of the invisible government by underscoring the next phase that propaganda techniques would follow, as civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. With the printing press and the newspaper, the telephone, telegraph, radio, and airplanes, ideas can spread rapidly and even instantaneously over the whole of America. To back up his point, Bemis quoted the mentor of public opinion manipulation, H. G. Wells. He cited a 1928 article in the New York Times in which Wells welcomed modern means of communication for opening up a new world of political processes, and for allowing the common design to be documented and sustained against perversion and betrayal. For Wells, the advent of mass communication leading up to television meant fantastic new paths for social control beyond the wildest dreams of the earlier mass manipulation fanatics of the British Fabian Society. We shall return to this vitally important subject later herein. Chapter 6 Mass Communications ushers in the polling industry for Bemis. His recognition of Wells' idea won him a key place in the hierarchy of U.S. public opinion controllers. In 1929, he won a position at CBS, which had recently been taken over by William Paley. By the same token, the advent of mass communications ushered in the polling/sampling industry, to organize the perceptions of the masses for the media mafia, part of the invisible government running the show from behind the scenes. By 1935 to 36, polling was in full swing. In the same year, Elmo Roper began his Fortune magazine for surveys, which evolved into his What People Are Thinking column for the New York Herald Tribune. George Gallup initiated the American Institute of Public Opinion. In 1936 he opened up the British Institute of Public Opinion. Gallup was to headquarter his activities around Princeton University, intermeshing with the Office of Public Opinion Research/Institute for International Social Research/Psychology department complex run by Hadley Cantrell, who was destined to play an increasingly important role in developing the psychological profiling methods later to be used in manufacturing the Aquarian conspiracy. In the same 1935 to 36 period, the first time use was made of polling in presidential elections, under the impetus of two newspapers owned by the Cowles family, the Minneapolis Star Tribune and the Des Moines Register. The Cowles are still in the news business. Based in Spokane, Washington, they are active opinion makers and their support of the Bush war in Iraq was a crucial factor. It is not certain who introduced the practice of advisors to the president, those persons who are not elected by the citizens and whom they have no opportunity to vet, but who decided the internal and external foreign policies of the nation. Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to make use of the practice. Opinion research and World War II, these were all small lead ups to the next phase, triggered by two important intersecting developments: the arrival of émigré psychological warfare expert Kurt Lewin in Iowa, and the involvement of the United States in World War II. World War II provided the emerging Tavistock social sciences scientists with enormous scope for experimentation. Lewin's leadership put together the key force that would deploy after World War II to utilize those techniques developed in warfare against the population of the United States. In fact, in 1946, Tavistock declared war on the civilian population of the United States and has remained in a state of war ever since. The basic conceptions expounded by Lewin, Wells, Bernays, and Lippmann remained in place as the guidepost for manipulation of public opinion. The war gave the social scientists the opportunity to apply them in highly concentrated form and to bring together a large number of institutions under their direction to further the ends of their experiments. The core institute, which was the vehicle for making public opinion, was the Committee on National Morale. Ostensibly established to mobilize support for the war, in much as President Wilson had set up his management committee to manage WWI, its real purpose was to carry out the intensive profiling of both the Axis and Americans' population for the purposes of creating and maintaining a means of social control. The committee was headed by several leaders of American society, including Robert P. Bass, Herbert Bayard Swope, among other notables. Its secretary was Margaret Mead's husband, Gregory Bateson, one of the principal instigators of the CIA's notorious MK-Ultra LSD experiments that some experts consider as the launch vehicle for the U.S. counterculture of drugs, rock, and sex. The committee's board of trustees included poll taker George Gallup, intelligence agent Lottie S. L. A. Sparrago, and Tavistock psychologist Gardner Murphy. The committee ran a number of special projects, the most important being a major study on how best to wage psychological warfare on Germany. The key personnel critical to the development of the public opinion project were Kurt K. Lewin, education and history, psychology, social sciences Professor Gordon W. Allport, psychology Professor Edwin G. Boren, psychology Professor Hadley Cantrell, psychology Ronald Lippitt, social sciences Margaret Mead, anthropology, social sciences, youth and child development. The staff numbered more than 100 researchers who comprised the staff of the committee, and several opinion profiling institutions critical to the project. One such a special project team was in the Office and Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, composed of Margaret Mead, Kurt Lewin, Ronald Lippitt, Dorwin Cartwright, John K. French, and public opinion makers like Samuel Stauffer, later chairman of the Laboratory's Social Relations Group at Harvard University, Paul Withersfeld of Columbia University's Sociology Department, who developed with profiler Harold Loss-Swell an opinion research methodology for the OSS based on detailed content analysis of the local press of enemy countries, and Rensis Likert, a Prudential insurance company key executive immediately before the war, had perfected profiling techniques as the director of research for the Life Insurance Agency Management Association. This equipped him to interact favorably with the head of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, who was the former head of Prudential Life Insurance Company. Likert served as director of the Division of Morale of the Strategic Bombing Survey from 1945 to 1946, from which position he had enormous scope for mass public opinion profiling and manipulation. The making of public opinion 33. According to Tavistock Institute records, the Strategic Bombing Survey played a key role in forcing Germany to its knees through a highly disciplined program of systematic bombing of German worker housing, which Sir Arthur Harris of the RAF was only too delighted to carry out. In addition, from 1939 to 1945, Likert ran the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture, from which major studies were undertaken in the techniques of mass persuasion, or to put it another way, making public opinion to fit the desired goals. One can only speculate on the numbers of citizens who believe their support for the Allied war effort sprang from their own opinions. One of Leichert's key aides in the division was Lewin protege and future Tavistock operative Dorwin Cartwright, who wrote the textbook document titled Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, which is still in use today. Another major agency for shaping public opinion was the Office of War Information, directed by Gardner Cowles for much of the war effort. Bernays was brought into OWI as an advisor. It is out of the nexus we have described here that the network of key polling institutions emerged after World War II. They have played a powerful and decisive role in American life ever since. Gallup, from the Committee on National Morale's Board of Trustees, upgraded his activity and became the key commander of polling institutions for launching new policies of the Committee of 300, which he passed off as polling results. Bemis played several key post-war roles. In 1953, he wrote a paper for the State Department that recommended setting up a psychological warfare office by state. In 1954, he was a consultant to the U.S. Air Force, the Armed Forces branch most under the influence of the Strategic Bombing Survey people. During this early 1950s period, Bernays was Public Relations Counsel to the United Fruit, United Brands Corporation, one of the leading corporations in the communications/national security apparat, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. Then busy with consolidating its power over U.S. policy, Bemis conducted the propaganda campaign alleging Guatemala was falling under communist control that resulted in a U.S. engineered coup in that country. In 1955, Bemis wrote a book about his experience titled The Engineering of Consent. The book became the virtual Tavistock blueprint followed by the U.S. government to overthrow any country whose policies were unacceptable to the one-world government socialist dictatorship. Throughout the post-war period, Bemis was a member of the Society for Applied Anthropology, one of Margaret Mead's social control institutions inside the U.S., and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, a group created by John Rawlings Rees, a founder member of Tavistock, to run psychiatric shock troops among the American population. One of its first actions was the unlashing of homosexuality in Florida, a move bitterly opposed by Anita Bryant, who had no idea of what she was up against. The second of its actions was to introduce the theme that non-white people are more intelligent than whites, which we shall discuss later. Leichert moved to the University of Michigan to set up the Institute for Social Research, ISR, that absorbed the Massachusetts Center for the Study of Group Dynamics, the principal Tavistock affiliate in the U.S. in the beginning of the post-war era. Tavistock's ISR was the center of a number of critical profiling and opinion research subgroups. Among them, the Center for Research in the Utilization of Scientific Knowledge was established by Leichert OSS co-worker and Lewin disciples, Ronald Lippitt. Project director Donald Michael was a leading player in the Club of Rome, and a second subgroup, the Survey Research Center, was Leichert's own personal creation that grew to become the most elaborate institution in the U.S. for surveying, creating popular attitudes and trends, among the principal of which were demeaning and degrading womanhood and pushing the superior intellectual capabilities of non-white persons according to Lewin's carefully crafted scripts. Robert Hutchins became famous during this period, and his closest colleague in those early years was William Benton, the founder in 1929 with Chester Bowles of Benton & Bowles, the well-known advertising firm. Benton utilized Benton & Bowles as a means to develop the science of mass control through advertising. It was Benton's pioneering work, supported by Douglas Cater, that led to the development of Tavistock's burgeoning control over U.S. media policy through the Aspen Institute of Colorado, the American home of the Socialist One World Government Committee of 300. In passing, I mentioned that the science of mass media control through advertising is today so firmly entrenched that it has become the key component in opinion making. In the early post-World War II days, Hollywood incorporated it into nearly all of its movies. Advertising, brainwashing, was done through the type and make-up car the hero drove, the brand of cigarette the swamp Lawrence Harvey smoked, the clothes and makeup the leading lady wore, clothes that became more risque with each passing year. Until today, in 2005, we have womanhood degraded by the likes of Britney Spears' almost naked breasts and bare stomach exposed by crotch-hugging jeans she often wears, the social mores that Hollywood enjoys so much in flouting. Degrading women and decline of moral standards. 37 The pace of degrading womanhood has quickened at a remarkable degree since hemlines reached the knee. This is manifesting itself in such areas as near pornography in mainstream movies and soap operas, and we venture to suggest that the day is not far off when such scenes will be total and mandatory. This decline in attractive feminine speech can be traced to Tavistock methodology and its practitioners, Cantrell, Likert, and Lewin. Another noticeable change was the increase in movies featuring interracial dating and sexual encounters coupled with human rights claims for lesbians in the most blatantly open form. Special people were selected and trained for this task, probably the best known of many being Ellen DeGeneres, who received hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free publicity under the guise of being interviewed on talk shows and discussion groups on the subject of same-sex love, meaning encounters between two females involving a type of sex practice. Benton, the pioneer in degrading womanhood, had as his mentor social scientists leading expert in profiling theory at Tavistock, one Harold Laswell, who together with Benton founded the American Policy Commission in 1940. Laswell's joint venture with Benton marked the clearest link between Aspen's hidden socialist one-world government operations in America and the Tavistock Institute. Aspen became the headquarters of the Committee of 300 branches in the United. Hedley Cantrell, Likert, and Lewin, with their humanistic psychology brainwashing applied methodology, played an increasingly vital role in using the opinion research to bring about paradigm shifts, value shifts in society, such as those just described, but on an expanded range and reaching into every level of society that comprised Western civilization as it had been known for centuries. Cantrell's home base from where he conducted his war operations against the American people was the Office of Public Opinion Research at Princeton University, founded in 1940, the same year in which Cantrell wrote his book entitled The Invasion from Mars, a detailed analysis about how the population of the New York, New Jersey area reacted with fear and panic to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, broadcast in 1938. How could they have known that they were part of a profiling venture, since it is reasonable to conclude that in 1938 not 1 in 5 million had ever heard of Hedley Cantrell or the Tavistock Institute? It would be interesting to find out how many Americans have heard of Tavistock now in 2005. Most would remember Orson Welles, but the probabilities are that 99% of the population would not attach any significance to the name Cantrell or have any knowledge of the Tavistock Institute. Let us recount the events of the night of October 30th, 1938, because the same techniques have been used by the Bush administration, the Defense Department, and the CIA to shape the public perception of the events that led up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and are still very much in use in 2005. In 1938, Orson Welles had created quite a reputation for himself as a master at staging faux news events by making use of the English author, H.G. Wells, a former MI6 operative, in his book, The War of the Worlds. In the radio adaptation of the Wells work, The Other Wells interrupted radio programs in New Jersey with an announcement that Martians had just landed. "The Martian invasion has begun," said Orson Welles. During the 4-hour-long production, it was announced no less than 4 times that what radio audiences were listening to was a fictitious reenactment of what it would be like if H.G. Wells' story had come to life. But that availed nothing. Panic gripped millions of people who fled from their homes in terror, jamming roads and communication systems. What was the purpose of the hoax? In the first instance, it was to gauge just how effective Cantrell and Tavistock's methods were in practice, and perhaps of greater importance, it was to set the stage for the coming war in Europe, in which news broadcasts would play a crucial role in information gathering and dissemination as an established source of reliable information, as well as a forum for directing public opinion. 2 days after the Martian invasion news broadcast, an editorial in the New York Times headed "Terror by Radio" inadvertently shed light on what Tavistock had in mind for the American people in the coming war now looming closer. What began as entertainment might readily have ended in disaster, the editorial said. Radio officials had a responsibility and should think twice before mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying. What the Times had inadvertently stumbled onto was the wave of the future seen through the eyes of the theoreticians at Tavistock. Henceforth, mingling news techniques with fiction so terrifying that it would be taken as fact was to be standard practice for the graduates of Tavistock. All news broadcasts were to be adaptations of news and fiction in a skillful blend so as to make the one unrecognizable from the other. In fact, Tavistock put their newly tested theory into practice a year later when the population of cities in Europe, London, Munich, Paris, and Amsterdam were smitten with war jitters. Even as Neville Chamberlain was successfully avoiding war, using the same techniques that were employed in the October 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts. How individuals and groups react to blending fact with fiction. 41 Cantwell's conclusion was that the public reacted exactly as his profiling research experiments had led him to believe it would. That Sunday night, October 30th, 1938 was to become a landmark date in his files and a date signifying a vast paradigm shift forever in the way that news would henceforth be presented. Slightly more than 7 decades later, the world is still being fed a diet of news mingled with fiction that in so many instances is terrifying. The Western world has undergone drastic changes unwillingly forced upon it, that it has become a world so vastly different from what it was on that October night in 1938, as to be in another planet. We shall return to this vital subject later in this work. Following the Second World War, Cantwell became totally involved with the head guru at Tavistock, its founder, John Rawlings Rees, and his World Tensions Project at the United Nations UNESCO. Profiles on how individuals and groups reacted to international tensions were formulated on the basis of skillfully blending fact with terrifying fiction in preparation for a campaign to launch world citizens of a one-world government socialist communist dictatorship that began to be employed to weaken national boundaries, language, and culture, and to discredit pride of nation and sovereignty of nation-states, in preparation for the coming of the socialist New World Order one-world government that President Woodrow Wilson said America would make safe for democracy. Those fresh-faced young American boys from Arkansas and North Carolina were sent marching off to Europe believing they were fighting for their country, never knowing that the democracy Wilson sent them to make safe for the world was a socialist international communist one-world government dictatorship. John Rawlings Rees was the publisher of Tavistock's magazine Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Their joint thinking mentality is seen in a 1955 monograph, Toward of Humanistic Psychology, and as a progression of Cantwell's support for the Tavistock Train Board and Airport's perception of the personality. As he expressed it in the 1947 book, Understanding Man's Social Behavior, in a chapter on causality. Cantwell's methodology was based on the conception that the particular environment in which growth takes place gives the particular individual a particular direction for growth. Cantwell's endeavors are good examples of the breakdown of boundaries between supposedly neutral opinion-taking and social engineering opinion-making. Tavistock's commitment to forcing major shifts in personality and behavior in all sectors of targeted population groups such as we have sought to describe. Cantwell appointed a board of directors to assist in the work, among who were Warren Bennies, a follower of Tavistock director Eric Trist, Marilyn Ferguson, allegedly the author of The Aquarian Conspiracy, Gene Houston, head of the Institute for Brain Research, member of the Club of Rome and author of Mind Games, Aldous Huxley, who supervised the MK-Ultra LSD program that ran for 20 years, Willis Harman, a Stanford University director and mentor of The Changing Images of Man, later disguised as The Aquarian Conspiracy, passed off as the work of Marilyn Ferguson, Michael Murphy, head of the East Salem Institute, established by Huxley and others as the Center for Sensitivity Training and Drug Experiments, James F. T. Budgenthal, an initiator of cult creation projects at East Salem, Abraham Maslow, the leading exponent of the irrationalist think force and founder of HP in 1957, Carl Rogers, Maslow's co-worker at the HP in 1957. HP's reigning ideology was exemplified by a book review in a 1966 issue of its journal, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Reviewing Maslow's book, The Psychology of Science, Willis Harman, a year before his 1967-69 Stanford research study, welcomed a challenge to science from extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, mysticism, and consciousness-expanding drugs, particularly LSD and mescaline. He lauded Maslow's new science since it would bring to the fore hypnosis, creativity, parapsychology, and psychedelic experience, and shift scientific concern away from the outside world to studying inner space. This was Cantwell's original particular personality thinking brought to its logical conclusion. to Cantrell goes the glory and honor of forcing a vast paradigm shift on the way the Western world thinks and behaves. Certainly Oswald Spengler would have had no trouble in identifying it as one of the causes of the downfall of the West he had predicted in 1936. Making changes in the cognitive and behavioral structure. Whatever the particular coloration of ideology that accompanied the scientists of the polling institutions after World War II, the invariant notion of social engineering, trough sampling methods, and opinion research could be found in Cartwright's paper Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, prepared for the Division of Program Surveys of the Department of Agriculture. The paper was subtitled, Selected Findings of Research on the Sale of United States War Bonds, but as Cartwright makes clear, the war-related aspect of the survey was just a pretext for conducting an analysis on the principles of how perception can be modified to suit whatever ends the controller might have in mind. One would be puzzled as to what the sale of war bonds had to do with agriculture, but that was part of Cartwright's methodology. It was the Bernays-Lipton-Cantrell-Cartwright hypothesis synthesized and concentrated in a World War II setting. The article was featured in Tavistock's journal, Human Relations, which ought to immediately brought the reader to attention. Among the many technological advances of the past century that have produced changes in social organization, Cartwright began, the development of the mass media of communication promises to be the most far-reaching. This heightened interdependence of people means that the possibilities of mobilizing mass social action have been greatly increased. It is conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will. We do not believe that Cartwright had Jesus Christ in mind when he made that statement. Under a subheading, Creating a Particular Cognitive Structure, Cartwright continues, Principle 1. It is considered a truism by virtually all psychologists that a person's behavior is guided by his perception of the world in which he lives. It follows from this formulation that one way to change a person's behavior is to modify his cognitive structure. The modification of cognitive structure in individuals by means of the mass media has several prerequisites. These may be stated in the form of principles. Interspersing his account with examples from the application of his study to the World War II war bonds sale drive, Cartwright then elaborated the principles, the message, i.e., information, facts, etc., must reach the sense organs of the persons who are to be influenced. Total stimulus situations are selected or rejected on the basis of an impression of their general characteristics, etc. A second set of principles investigated more deeply the methods of altering cognitive structure. Principle 2, having reached the sense organs, message must be accepted as part of the person's cognitive structure. Cartwright noted in this section that any effort to change behavior through a modification of this cognitive structure must overcome the forces tending to maintain the present structure. Only when a given cognitive structure seems to the person to be unsatisfactory for his adjustment is he likely readily to receive influences designed to change that structure. Under creating a particular motivational structure, Cartwright analyzed further the social inductions the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in Washington into turmoil for a protracted period. Poland comes of age 47. The Tavistock Clinic in London was where Sigmund Freud had settled when he arrived from Germany, and where his nephew.
Thanks, guys. We went through a few chapters there, so I think I'm gonna just end it here tonight. I don't know. What do you think? Could you hear the book okay? Let me know. I think I'm going to do this again. If I'm going to listen to it, I might as well put it out there, and if I can get a couple more people to listen to it, well, that's a good thing. So I'll just rock out here for a couple minutes, and yeah, thanks again, guys. Thank you.